6 nurses touched that wound. 6 nurses died within the week. Nobody warned Iris Calloway about any of them. She was the 7th nurse hired to treat it. And by the time she learned what actually happened to the 6 before her, she had already fallen in love with the man dying inside it. That was the cost nobody told her about. Not the money, not the danger, the falling. 11 years earlier, a rival vampire lord drove a cursed blade into Sebastian Vale's side and vanished, leaving behind a wound that refused to close, a wound that killed every healer skilled enough to actually threaten it. 6 physicians, 6 graves, and a 7th woman walking through the front gate with a duffel bag over her shoulder, and a brother back home who had maybe 14 months left to live, certain she was only there to change a bandage. She was wrong about that within the first hour. Savannah wears its history the way old money wears grief. Quietly, beneath layers of Spanish moss and wrought iron, so that a stranger driving past the live oaks along the river road would never guess that somewhere behind that curtain of grey-green lace sat an estate older than the United States itself, and inside it, a king who had been dying for 11 years without the mercy of actually dying. Ashencroft did not appear on any map that mattered. The postal service delivered to a gate 3 miles from the house and stopped there. Handed off to a private courier who never spoke, never lingered, never asked why the family who owned 4,000 acres of low-country marsh never once appeared at a Savannah gala, never donated a wing to a hospital under their own name, never let their photograph touch a newspaper. The locals who remembered the old stories called it the Vale Place, and said it with the particular hush reserved for things that were better left unvisited after dark. Sebastian Vale was the sovereign of the entire Atlantic coastal court, a lineage that predated the founding of the colony itself, a creature whose name alone had once been enough to end wars between rival bloodlines before the first drop of blood was spilled. He had ruled with a kind of exhausted, meticulous control for 3 centuries, holding together a fragile peace between covens that hated each other more than they feared him, because fear, he had learned long ago, was the only currency that did not eventually devalue. But for the past 11 years, the king of the coast had been quietly, agonizingly rotting from the inside, and no one, not his physicians, not his generals, not the ancient bloodlines who owed him their loyalty, had been able to explain why. It began, as these things do, with a single wound that would not close. Iris Calloway had been a trauma nurse for 6 years, 4 of them in the emergency department of a hospital that never had enough staff and never would, the kind of place where you learn to read a person's entire life story in the 15 seconds it took to get vitals, where you learned which kinds of silence in a waiting room meant grief and which kind meant guilt. She was 29 years old, and she had not slept more than 5 hours in a single stretch since her brother Milo's heart had started failing 2 years earlier, a rare congenital defect that had been manageable with medication until it suddenly, viciously, was not. The specialist in Charleston had been blunt about it. In the particular clinical cruelty doctors reserve for families they assume can't afford hope. Milo needed a transplant. Milo needed it within 18 months. Or the numbers stopped being numbers and started being a date. And a heart transplant, even with insurance, even with every favor Iris could call in from every nurse and doctor and social worker she had ever helped in 6 years of unpaid overtime, cost more than she would make in the rest of her natural life. She had stopped believing in miracles around the same time she stopped believing anyone was coming to save her, which was why, when the recruiter called, she almost hung up. The offer came through a private medical staffing agency she had never heard of, one that did not appear in any registry she could find when she searched it at 2 in the morning, with Milo asleep on the couch beside her, an oxygen line taped gently beneath his nose. A live-in position, the recruiter said. Private client, extremely high compensation, extraordinary discretion required. Immediate start. The salary quoted made Iris actually laugh out loud, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound, because it was not a nurse's salary. It was the kind of number that solved problems, all of them, at once. She asked what the position actually required. The recruiter, a soft-spoken man with an accent she couldn't place, told her only that the client suffered from a chronic wound requiring specialized, ongoing wound care, that 6 previous nurses had been unable to complete the contract, and that if she required more detail than that, she was welcome to decline. He did not explain what had happened to the 6. He did not need to. Something in the careful, rehearsed neutrality of his voice told her not to ask. Twice. She should have said no. She thought about saying no for exactly as long as it took to glance across the room at her brother's sleeping face, pale under the blue light of the television, his chest rising and falling in that faint, effortful way that had become the metronome of her entire existence. She said yes before she let herself think about it any further. They came for her 3 days later in a car with windows so dark they looked like they'd swallowed the daylight whole. And the drive out past the edge of the city took nearly 2 hours, the pavement giving way to gravel, the gravel giving way to a private road so overgrown with low branches that the car had to slow to walking pace, moss dragging along the roofline like fingers testing the seal of a door. When the house finally rose out of the fog, Iris understood, in a single silent breath, why the 6 nurses before her might have run. Ashencroft was not a house. It was a fortress dressed as one, a sprawling 3-story structure of dark stone and black iron, its windows deep set and shuttered, its grounds so meticulously, unnaturally still that not even the birds seemed willing to nest there. A woman was waiting on the front steps when the car pulled up, tall and severe, dressed in a uniform so precisely tailored, it looked more like armor than clothing. She introduced herself only as Mrs. Ferris, head of household staff, and did not offer her hand. "You will not go past the East Wing without an escort, Mrs." Ferris said. Before Iris had even fully stepped out of the car, her voice clipped and rehearsed, the tone of someone who had given this exact speech 6 times before and had learned, painfully, not to skip a single line of it. "You will not discuss anything you see or hear here with anyone outside these walls, under any circumstances, for any reason, for the remainder of your natural life. You will not enter the master's chamber without being summoned, and you will, under no circumstances, touch his wound without gloves and without his explicit permission, regardless of what you believe you are seeing or how urgent it appears. Do you understand these terms?" Iris said that she did, though she understood almost none of it, and followed Mrs. Ferris through a front hall so cavernous it swallowed the sound of her own footsteps, past portraits of men and women in clothing that spanned 3 centuries of fashion, all of them sharing the same pale, unnervingly still eyes, all of them watching her pass with an expression she would later learn to recognize as the particular boredom of the very old. The house smelled of beeswax candles and something colder underneath it, something metallic and faintly sweet that she would come to associate, in time, with the smell of very old blood. She was given a suite on the second floor, extravagant beyond anything she had ever slept in, and told that dinner would be brought to her room and that she would meet the master of the house the following evening, once he had been informed of her arrival. She sat on the edge of a bed large enough to sleep 4 people and called her aunt, who was staying with Milo for the 2 weeks. Iris had been told to expect this contract might last, and she did not mention the 6 nurses, or the strange, cold weight that had settled into her chest the moment she walked through Ashencroft's front doors, because there was no version of that conversation that ended with her aunt letting her stay. The following evening, an hour after sundown, Mrs. Ferris came to collect her. The east wing was colder than the rest of the house. A deliberate cold, Iris would later understand. The kind achieved through careful engineering rather than accident. And the corridor leading to the master's chamber was lined with old iron sconces holding candles that burned with a strange, low blue flame instead of orange. Mrs. Ferris stopped outside a set of double doors carved from a wood so dark it was nearly black, knocked twice, and did not wait for an answer before pushing them open and stepping aside to let Iris pass alone. The room beyond was enormous, a private chamber with vaulted ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows shuttered against the last light of dusk. And in the center of it, in a bed that looked more like a throne than a place to sleep, lay the sovereign of the Atlantic coast. Sebastian Vale did not look like a dying man. That was the first thing Iris noticed, the thing that would trouble her for days afterward, because everything about him, the sharp aristocratic lines of his face, the dark hair swept back from a high forehead, the broad shoulders visible even beneath the loose linen shirt he wore unbuttoned at the collar, suggested a kind of terrifying, coiled vitality, a man built for violence and command rather than a sickbed. It was only when she stepped closer, when her eyes adjusted to the dim blue light, that she saw the wound. It sat low on his left side, just beneath his ribs, and it was unlike anything 6 years in an emergency department had prepared her to see. The flesh around it had gone a deep, necrotic black, veined through with threads of something that looked disturbingly like tarnished silver, pulsing faintly beneath the skin in a rhythm that did not match a heartbeat, that matched nothing Iris had ever studied in any textbook. The wound itself did not look infected in any conventional sense. It looked, she thought, and the thought made her stomach turn, like something was still inside it, patient, feeding, waiting. "You are staring," Mr. Vale said, and his voice was low and precise, faintly amused. Despite the visible exhaustion carved into every line of his face, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and mildly curious about anyone who forgot that fact for even a moment. "It's rude, Miss Calloway. I'm sorry," Iris said, though she did not look away, because the professional part of her brain, the part that had spent 6 years assessing wounds in 15-second windows, had already started cataloging everything wrong with what she was seeing, and she found, to her own surprise, that the fear she had been carrying since the front gate had quieted into something closer to focus. "That's not an infection." "No," Sebastian agreed. "It is not. What is it?" "A very old mistake," he said, and something in his voice closed the subject as firmly as a door. 6 physicians before you have asked that question. I have found the answer does not particularly help with the treatment. Iris set her bag down at the foot of the bed and pulled on a pair of gloves, mostly to give her hands something to do. Because she had already decided, in the space of that single exchange, that she was not going to be the kind of nurse who let a patient's evasiveness stop her from doing her job, immortal king or otherwise. "May I examine it?" Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise, so brief she nearly missed it, as though the question itself was not one he had expected to hear, asked so plainly, so professionally, without the trembling deference the previous 6 nurses had apparently offered him. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes an unsettling pale grey that seemed to catch the blue candlelight and hold it. And then he nodded, once, and drew back the edge of the blanket to give her better access. "You should know," he said, as she leaned in, as her gloved fingers hovered above the ruined flesh, "that this wound has killed everyone who has touched it with any real intention to heal it. Not immediately, not obviously, but it has, without exception, killed them within the week. I tell you this not to frighten you away, though you would be wise to be frightened, but because I find I am tired of watching people die without understanding what they have agreed to." Iris's hands did not shake, though she noted, distantly, that they probably should have. "Then why let me touch it at all?" "Because," Sebastian said, and for the first time she heard something underneath the aristocratic cool of his voice, something raw and old and profoundly tired. "Because the alternative is that I simply continue to rot, slowly, for however many more years my body chooses to make me endure it. And because, for reasons I have not yet decided whether to regret, I find I would rather have one more honest conversation before I die than one more physician too afraid of me to tell me the truth." She examined the wound for nearly 20 minutes that first night, her gloved fingers moving with the careful, practiced efficiency of 6 years of trauma work. And the deeper she looked, the less sense it made by any medical logic she possessed. The necrotic tissue at the wound's edges was not spreading in the pattern of any infection she knew, not radiating outward in the expected gradient of dying cells, but pulsing, contracting and releasing in slow, uneven waves, as though something inside the wound were breathing. The silver-threaded veins beneath the surface did not track along any vascular pathway a human anatomy chart would predict, curling instead in a pattern that looked disturbingly, almost deliberate, almost written, like the wound had been carved not by a blade but by an intention. "This isn't healing wrong," Iris said finally, sitting back on her heels. "This is being kept open. Something is actively preventing it from closing." Sebastian's pale eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the room feel suddenly smaller. None of the others said that. What did they say? They said it was infected. They said it was cursed and unfixable. They said, one of them, that it was simply the cost of the crown, and that I should learn to live with the pain the way I have learned to live with everything else. He paused, and something like the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though there was no warmth in it, only a kind of grim, exhausted respect. "You are the first person in 11 years to tell me the truth is more complicated than that it cannot be healed." "I didn't say it could be healed," Iris said carefully. "I said something is preventing it. Those aren't the same thing, but they're not nothing either." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her the way she imagined he studied everyone, as though weighing the exact value of her in some private ledger only he could read. And then he said, quietly, "You are going to want to leave in the morning. Miss Calloway. I would advise you to do it. Whatever fee you were promised, I will have it wired to you regardless, and you may go home and never think of this house again. Why would I leave? She asked, though even as the words left her mouth she understood, distantly, that this was the moment, the exact hinge point, where the 6 nurses before her had presumably made a different choice, and something in her, something stubborn and exhausted and desperate, in a way that had nothing to do with the money anymore, refused to take the easy door out of the room. "Because I am telling you the truth," Sebastian said, his voice dropping into something quieter, something almost gentle beneath the exhaustion. "And the truth is that I do not yet know what this wound will cost the person who finally heals it. Only that it has cost something from every single person who has tried. I would rather you walk away wealthy and whole than stay and become the 7th name I have to apologize to in a grave I did not dig myself." "I've buried people before," Iris said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, steadier than she felt. "I've held hands while machines stopped beeping. I know what it costs to try to save someone and fail. I'm still here. I'm not leaving because you're scared for me, Mr. Vale. I've had worse odds with worse pay." Something shifted behind his pale eyes then. Something she would spend the following weeks trying to name and never quite managing to. And he did not argue with her again that night, though she would come to understand, much later, that his silence in that moment had not been agreement. It had been the particular silence of a man who had already decided he was going to let her stay and hated himself a little for it. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt, despite everything, almost domestic. Iris rose in the late afternoon, since the household kept vampire hours out of necessity, and spent the early evening reviewing what little medical documentation existed on Sebastian's condition, 6 different physicians' notes that grew progressively shorter and more evasive as the years passed, as though each of them had learned, too late, that certain kinds of documentation were dangerous to leave behind. She treated the wound each night at the same hour, cleaning it with a saline solution that did nothing to slow the necrosis, but seemed, at least, to keep the surrounding tissue from becoming actively infected on top of whatever was already wrong with it. And she spent the rest of each night sitting with him, at first out of professional obligation, and then, as the weeks wore on, because she found she no longer wanted to be anywhere else. Sebastian Vale was not what she had expected a 300-year-old vampire king to be. He was precise and dryly funny in a way that caught her off guard the first several times, delivering devastating observations about the absurdities of court politics with a completely straight face until she laughed despite herself, and then looking faintly, genuinely pleased that he had managed it. He asked her questions about her life with a curiosity that felt entirely unfeigned, about the hospital, about the particular exhaustion of watching people die in a system too broken to save them, about Milo, whose name she had not meant to say out loud the first time it slipped out, but which she found herself returning to again and again, because Sebastian listened in a way almost no one in her life had ever had the patience to. "Your brother," he said one night, roughly 3 weeks into her contract, as she cleaned the wound with the careful, familiar motions that had become second nature. "Tell me about him." "He's 17, Iris said. "He wants to be a marine biologist. He's got this whole plan. He wants to study coral reef restoration. He talks about it like it's the only thing in the world that matters. And I let him, Because for 2 hours at a time when he's talking about Coral, he forgets that his heart is failing. He paused there, listening, and she found herself continuing before she'd decided to. He needs a transplant. Soon. We're on a list, but the list doesn't care how much you love someone. It just cares about numbers, and the numbers aren't good. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that had nothing to do with the room they were sitting in. Is that why you took this position? The money? Yes, Iris said, because she had decided, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, that she was not going to lie to him, not about this. I would have said yes to almost anything. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I appreciate the honesty, he said quietly. Most people who come through this house tell me what they think I want to hear. It is, I confess, a rather refreshing kind of exhausting to be told the truth instead. It was around the start of the 4th week that Iris began to notice the pattern that the previous physicians, in their fear or their carelessness or their simple lack of the specific kind of attention 6 years of triage work had trained into her, had apparently missed entirely. The wound did not simply exist in a static, unchanging state of decay. It responded. It reacted, subtly, to the presence of certain people in the house, contracting and darkening whenever Mrs. Ferris's second-in-command, a soft-spoken, unfailingly courteous vampire named Cassius Thorne, who served as Sebastian's seneschal and closest advisor, entered the room in a way it did not react to anyone else. Not to Mrs. Ferris, not to the household guards, not even to Sebastian's own occasional flares of temper. She said nothing about it at first, because she had no framework for what it might mean, no medical language for a wound that seemed to hold an opinion about the people in a room, and because Cassius Thorne, in the handful of interactions she'd had with him, had been nothing but gracious, warm even, welcoming her to the household, with a kind of easy charm that made him, if anything, the most approachable person in Ashencroft aside from Sebastian himself. He brought her coffee some mornings when she stumbled bleary-eyed to the kitchens after a long night of wound care. He asked after her brother by name, remembered small details she'd only mentioned once in passing, told her more than once how relieved the entire household was that she had chosen to stay when the others had not. It was the coffee, in the end, that made her start paying closer attention, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because of the precise, practiced way Cassius always handed it to her. The careful angle of his wrist, the way his eyes lingered a half-second too long on her hands whenever she reached for it, the particular kind of attentiveness that Iris, after 6 years of learning to read the difference between genuine concern and performed concern in a hospital waiting room, had trained herself to recognize instinctively. She started declining the coffee. She told herself it was nothing, that she was being paranoid in a house full of centuries-old predators where paranoia was probably a reasonable baseline setting. And she kept treating the wound every night, kept sitting with Sebastian in the slow hours before dawn, kept feeling the strange, unfamiliar warmth of being genuinely listened to for the first time, in longer than she could remember. And she kept noticing, in the careful, quiet way she had built an entire career on noticing things other people missed, that the wound darkened every single time Cassius Thorne so much as walked past the open door of the master's chamber, and that Sebastian, for all his 3 centuries of accumulated wisdom, seemed to be the only person in the house who had never once looked closely enough to see it. The night everything changed began, as these nights always seemed to, with a conversation Sebastian had not meant to have. "You ask a great many questions for a nurse who was only hired to change bandages," he said, watching her work with an expression she had started to recognize over the past weeks as something dangerously close to fondness, though she told herself, firmly, not to read too much into an immortal king's face. "You have a wound no one can explain, and 6 dead nurses," Iris said, without looking up from her work. "Forgive me for being curious about the details." "Curiosity killed the previous 6, he said, though there was no real warning in it anymore. More a kind of tired, affectionate resignation, the sound of a man who had stopped expecting her to take his warnings seriously several weeks earlier and had, despite himself, come to look forward to her ignoring them. "Then tell me the truth and maybe I won't have to guess at it," she said. And something in her voice must have carried more weight than she intended, because Sebastian went very still, and for a long moment the only sound in the room was the low crackle of the blue candles along the wall. 11 years ago, he said finally, his voice dropping into a register she had not heard from him before, something older and heavier, stripped of the dry humor he usually wore like armor. There was a war. Not the kind fought with armies, though it cost nearly as many lives. A war between bloodlines, between my court and the Reventhal's line. An old and vicious family from the northern courts who believed, not entirely without reason, that the coastal territories should belong to them rather than to me. I won that war. I am not proud of everything I did to win it, but I won it. And Augustin Reventhal's, the last surviving head of that house, did not forgive me for it. What does that have to do with the wound? Augustin did not die in that war, Sebastian said, quietly. He fled it, and he spent the following decade, by all accounts, deep in the kind of old and forbidden magic that even our own kind consider dangerous to touch. 11 years ago, on the anniversary of the battle that broke his house, he returned. He did not bring an army. He came alone into this house, past every guard I had, and he put a blade into my side that had been steeped in something I still do not fully understand. And by the time my people found him and killed him for it, the damage had already been done. The wound has not closed since. Iris sat back slowly, processing this, turning it over, with the same methodical care she gave to any complicated case history. And nobody thought to ask what kind of curse it was, what it was designed to do. "We asked," Sebastian said, with a bitterness that surprised her. "We asked every scholar, every old bloodline with a library worth raiding, every physician with a reputation for the impossible. The answer, when we could get one at all, was always the same. The curse was built to punish, not to kill outright. It was built to make me watch myself decay for as long as possible, and to make certain that anyone who tried to heal it paid a price of their own for the attempt." He looked at her then, and his pale eyes were unbearably direct. "That is the part I did not tell you on your first night here, Miss Calloway, because I did not yet know if you would need to hear it. Every physician who has touched this wound with genuine skill, with genuine intention to heal it, rather than merely dress it, has paid a cost. Not death, not directly, though death has followed for all 6 of them regardless. The curse does not simply kill the healer. It takes something first. A memory, a year of their life, a piece of what makes them who they are. And only once it has taken that price does it allow itself to be touched at all. The room felt suddenly very cold. And you didn't think that was worth mentioning before I put my hands on it every night for the past month. I did not know if it had started taking from you yet, Sebastian said. And for the first time since she had met him, his composure cracked entirely, revealing something underneath it that looked almost like fear, an emotion she would not have believed a month ago that this particular ancient and terrifying creature was capable of feeling. I have watched 6 people die slowly for the crime of trying to help me, Iris, and I let it happen every single time because I told myself the wound would simply keep killing everyone until someone strong enough, or lucky enough, or simply immune enough, finally broke the curse for good. I told myself that was a fair trade for my throne, for my people, for the peace I am supposed to be keeping. But I find, watching you, that I no longer believe it is a fair trade at all. And I do not know what to do with that. Because you are the first physician in 11 years who has actually made me want to survive this, instead of simply enduring it. Iris did not know what to say to that. She looked down at her gloved hands, at the black and silver-threaded wound still open beneath them, and felt, for the first time since she had walked through Ashencroft's front doors, the full and terrible weight of exactly what she had agreed to. "What has it already taken from me?" she asked quietly. "Do you know?" "I don't," Sebastian admitted. "I have never known until it was too late to matter. But I intend to find out before it takes anything else. And I intend, Miss Calloway, to make sure that whatever this costs you, it does not cost you your life, the way it cost the other 6 theirs." She should have been afraid. She noted, distantly, with the same clinical part of her mind that had spent 6 years assessing danger in 15-second windows, that fear was almost certainly the correct response to what she had just been told. But sitting there in the low blue candlelight, with Sebastian Vale watching her with an expression that held more raw vulnerability than she had ever seen on the face of anyone, mortal or otherwise, she found that what she actually felt was something closer to resolve. "Then we'd better figure out what it wants," she said, and reached for her supplies again, and did not stop working. It took her 4 more nights of careful, methodical observation to understand that the wound was not, in fact, punishing her at random, the way it had apparently punished the 6 nurses before her. It was responding to something specific, something environmental, and she only understood what when she finally allowed herself to trust the instinct that had been nagging at her since the 2nd week, the instinct that had made her stop drinking Cassius Thorne's coffee without ever quite admitting to herself why. She began keeping a log, discreetly, of exactly when the wound darkened and when it eased, cross-referencing it against the household schedule Mrs. Ferris kept posted in the servants' hall, and the pattern that emerged made her blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with the perpetual chill of the East Wing. The wound worsened every single time Cassius Thorne came within 30 feet of the master's chamber. It worsened, specifically, on the nights he brought Sebastian his evening correspondence. The same nights, she realized with mounting horror that Sebastian's exhaustion always seemed most pronounced, his color worst, his composure most fragile. She did not go to Sebastian with a theory yet. She had spent 6 years in an emergency department learning the difference between a hunch and evidence, and she was not going to accuse the second most powerful person in this house of anything without something more solid than a coincidence in a nurse's private notebook. So instead, on the fifth night, she did something that every rational part of her understood was deeply, catastrophically foolish, and did it anyway, because Milo needed her to come home with more than just a paycheck, and because some quieter, more dangerous part of her had started needing Sebastian Vale to survive this, for reasons that had stopped being about money weeks ago. She waited until the house had gone still with the particular silence of the deep pre-dawn hours, when even a household of the undead settled into something like sleep, and she went looking for Cassius Thorne's private study. The study sat at the far end of the east wing. Past a servant's corridor Iris had only ever walked through once before, its door unremarkable enough that she might have missed it entirely if she had not spent 5 nights memorizing the exact geography of a household built deliberately to be confusing to outsiders. It was unlocked, which struck her, even in the moment, as either a sign of supreme confidence or supreme carelessness, and she told herself, with a kind of grim resolve that felt entirely unlike the person she had been 6 weeks earlier, that she would find out which before the sun rose. The room was smaller than she expected, lined floor to ceiling with shelves of books in languages she did not recognize, their spines cracked with age, their titles embossed in letters that seemed to shift faintly when she looked at them directly. A heavy oak desk sat in the center, and it was there, in the shallow top drawer, beneath a stack of correspondence written in Cassius Thorne's neat, careful hand, that she found the ledger. It took her a long moment to understand what she was looking at, because the entries were coded, references to shipments and dates and sums of money that meant nothing to her on their own, but woven through the coded entries were names she recognized immediately, because she had spent the last several weeks reading every scrap of documentation Ashencroft possessed about Sebastian's condition. The 6 physicians, their names, their dates of hire, their dates of death, all recorded in Cassius Thorne's precise hand, alongside sums of money that made Iris's stomach turn. Payments received, not payments made, each one dated within days of a nurse's death. And beneath the list of the 6, in ink so fresh it had barely dried, was a 7th line. Her own name. No death date beside it yet. Only a single word, underlined twice, in a language she did not read, but understood instinctively, with the particular cold clarity of someone staring directly at their own obituary. Soon, she did not hear the door open behind her. She heard, instead, the soft, unhurried sound of Cassius Thorne's voice, warm and courteous as it had always been, utterly unbothered by the sight of her standing over his open desk with his ledger in her hands. "You are a very thorough woman, Miss Calloway," he said. "I confess I did not expect you to find this quite so quickly. The others were considerably less observant. I suppose that is rather the point of view, isn't it? The reason he keeps you around." Iris's heart was hammering, but she made herself set the ledger down slowly, carefully, the way she had learned, over 6 years of emergency rooms, to move when a situation had gone suddenly and irreversibly wrong. No sudden gestures, no visible panic, because panic was the thing that got people killed in rooms like this one. You've been poisoning him. The correspondence. That's how you're feeding the curse. Cassius smiled. And for the first time since she had met him, the warmth in it did not reach his eyes at all. revealing something underneath that had been there the entire time, patient and cold, and entirely without mercy. Poisoning implies I am doing something to him he did not already have coming, he said, stepping further into the room, closing the door softly behind him, with a click that felt, in the silence, unbearably final. Augustine Reventhal's curse was never going to close on its own, Miss Calloway. It required a conduit, someone inside the house, someone with access to the wound's environment, someone capable of feeding it exactly enough dark magic to keep it open without ever being suspected. I have been that conduit for 11 years. I have watched 6 nurses die, trying to undo what I have spent over a decade very carefully maintaining. And I will confess, watching you work these past weeks has been the closest thing to genuine entertainment I have experienced in longer than I care to admit. Why? Iris asked, though some cold, analytical part of her mind had already begun assembling the answer before he spoke it aloud. Why do this to him? He trusts you. He calls you his oldest friend. He does. Cassius agreed, and something almost like regret flickered across his face before it hardened again into the same patient cruelty. And for the first century of our acquaintance, that trust was earned honestly. But sovereignty is not inherited by love, Miss Calloway. It is inherited by strength. And Sebastian Vale has held this throne for 300 years through a combination of brutal competence and the simple, exhausting willingness to keep going long after any reasonable creature would have surrendered to the weight of it. I do not hate him. I want you to understand that. Because I suspect it will matter to you later, in whatever time you have left to think about it. I do not hate him at all. I simply believe, as many in this court have come to believe over 11 long years of watching him bleed slowly from a wound he refuses to explain to anyone but the woman paid to clean it, that a court led by a dying king is a court in danger, and that the coastal territories deserve a sovereign who is not quietly rotting from the inside while pretending night after night that he is still fit to rule. You're going to let him die so you can take the throne, Iris said flatly. I am going to let the curse finish what Augustine started. Cassius corrected gently, as though the distinction mattered to him a great deal, as though he had spent 11 years constructing exactly this kind of careful, self-serving grammar to sleep at night. I have simply made certain along the way that no physician clever enough to actually undo the damage ever survived long enough to try. And you, Miss Calloway, have become considerably more clever than I anticipated, considerably faster than the others. And I'm afraid that means our timeline has to accelerate rather sooner than I had planned. He moved toward her then, not quickly, not with any of the violent speed she had come to associate with vampires in the weeks she'd spent at Ashencroft, but with the slow, deliberate confidence of a predator who had never once in 3 centuries needed to hurry. And Iris understood, in the single suspended second before he crossed the last few feet between them, that she was about to become the 7th name in a ledger that had already claimed 6 lives before hers, and that no amount of careful observation or clinical detachment was going to save her from a creature who had spent 11 years perfecting exactly this kind of quiet, unhurried murder. She did the only thing she could think to do. She screamed Sebastian's name into a house full of the undead. At an hour when every rational part of her understood he would be exactly where she needed him to be, awake, alone, and listening for her the way he had listened for her every single night for the past 6 weeks. The response was immediate and catastrophic. The study door did not simply open, it came apart. The ancient oak splintering into fragments as though struck by something with the force of a runaway vehicle, and Sebastian Vale stood in the wreckage of his own seneschal's doorway, with an expression Iris had never seen on him before. Not the dry, weary composure of the man she had spent 6 weeks caring for, but something older and far more dangerous. Something that made the temperature of the room drop by what felt like 10 full degrees in the space of a single breath. Cassius froze, his hand still outstretched toward Iris, and for a long, terrible moment, nobody in the room moved at all. "Step away from her," Sebastian said, and his voice was not loud, was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made the shelves along the walls tremble, that made the ancient books shudder on their spines as though flinching away from the sound of it. "I am only going to offer you this chance once, old friend. Step away from her now, and we will discuss, calmly, exactly how long you have known about this ledger, and exactly how thoroughly you intend to explain yourself." Cassius did not step away. Instead, something in his posture shifted, the warm, courteous mask falling away entirely, to reveal the centuries of patient calculation underneath it. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of the gentleness Iris had mistaken. "For 6 long weeks, for genuine kindness, I have watched you decay for 11 years, Sebastian," he said quietly, and there was real grief in it, real and complicated, and entirely insufficient to excuse what he had done. "I have watched you hold this court together while a curse ate you alive from the inside, and I told myself, at first, that I was simply waiting for the natural order of things to take its course. But natural order is a luxury we do not have, and I am done waiting for you to die with dignity when I could simply help the process along and save this court 11 more years of watching its king slowly disappear." "You poisoned my correspondence," Sebastian said, and his voice had gone very quiet now, very still, in the particular way Iris had already learned in 6 weeks of careful observation meant he was closer to violence than he had ever been in her presence. "You fed a dead man's curse for over a decade. You let 6 people die in this house believing they had simply failed to heal an unhealable wound, when the entire time you were the reason it could never close." "I did what was necessary," Cassius said, and lunged, not towards Sebastian, who could have ended him in a heartbeat, and both of them knew it, but toward Iris, toward the one uncertain variable in a room otherwise occupied entirely by creatures far older and far stronger than she would ever be. Because a desperate man reaches always for the thing his enemy cannot afford to lose. Iris did not have time to be afraid. She had time only to feel the cold, iron grip of Cassius Thorne's hand close around her wrist. Time to feel herself yanked backward with a force that should have snapped bone. And then, in the same fractured half-second, she felt that grip vanish entirely, torn away by something faster than her eyes could track, and she was on the floor of the study, with her heart slamming against her ribs and the taste of copper in her mouth from where she had bitten her own tongue. And across the room, Sebastian Vale had Cassius Thorne pinned against the ruined doorframe with a hand around his throat, his pale eyes gone entirely black, his fangs fully extended, in a way she had never once seen in 6 weeks of careful, quiet nights, 11 years. Sebastian said, and his voice had stopped sounding human at all, had dropped into something ancient and resonant that seemed to come from everywhere in the room at once. 11 years I called you my oldest friend. 11 years I let you sit beside my bed while I bled, and the entire time, you were the knife. I did it for the court, Cassius gasped, though there was no real fight left in him now, only the particular desperate honesty of a man who understood, finally, that he had run out of time to lie his way free. A dying king cannot protect his people forever, Sebastian. I only ever wanted what was best for the coast. You wanted my throne, Sebastian said flatly. Do not dress ambition in the language of duty. I have ruled long enough to recognize the difference, even from the mouth of a man I trusted more than any other living thing in 3 centuries. Iris pushed herself up onto her elbows, her wrist throbbing where Cassius's grip had bruised it, and watched, with a strange, detached clarity that felt like the aftermath of every code she had ever run in an emergency department. The moment when Sebastian Vale's fury reached the exact edge of something irreversible. His grip tightened. Cassius's eyes bulged, his desperate hands scrabbling uselessly at the iron hold around his throat. And, for a single suspended moment, Iris understood that she was watching a king decide, in real time, whether to end the life of the closest thing he had to a brother. Don't, she said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended, hoarse from the scream that had brought him crashing through the door in the first place. Sebastian, don't kill him. Yet. His eyes flicked toward her, black and terrible, and, underneath all of it, still recognizably him. Still the same man who had asked her, gently, about her brother's dreams of coral reefs 3 weeks earlier. Give me one reason. Because he's the only one who knows exactly what Augustine's curse requires to be broken, Iris said, forcing herself up onto her feet, despite the way the room still tilted faintly at the edges. Because if you kill him right now, in anger, you lose 11 years of information about exactly how this wound works. And I am not going to let you make that trade. Not after everything it's already cost. For a long, taut moment, nothing in the room moved at all, and Iris watched Sebastian Vale wage a silent, visible war against 300 years of instinct that told him a betrayal of this magnitude deserved nothing less than immediate and total annihilation. And then, slowly, with a control that seemed to cost him something physical, he released his grip, letting Cassius crumple to the floor gasping, and stepped back, his chest heaving with breaths he did not technically need to take. Bind him, Sebastian said to the guards who had finally arrived in the doorway, drawn by the sound of splintering wood, and his voice had gone cold and flat, and entirely without mercy. Now, the voice, Iris understood, of the king who had won a war against an entire rival bloodline 300 years earlier, and had never once, in all that time, forgotten how. Take him to the lower cells. He does not eat. He does not sleep undisturbed. And he does not speak to another living soul in this house until I have decided exactly how much of what he knows I intend to extract from him before I finally let him die for what he has done. The guards dragged Cassius Thorne from the room, and in the sudden, ringing silence that followed, Sebastian turned to Iris with an expression that had shed every trace of the monster she had glimpsed only moments earlier, leaving behind only a man, exhausted and shaken and staring at her as though he could not quite believe she was still standing in front of him. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and his voice shook, faintly, in a way she had never heard from him before. "I'm fine," she said, though her wrist was already darkening into a bruise and her hands had not entirely stopped trembling. He didn't get the chance to do anything worse. Sebastian crossed the room in 2 strides and took her injured wrist in both his hands with a gentleness that seemed almost violent in its contrast to the fury she had just watched him unleash. Turning it carefully in the low light, his jaw tight with something that looked unmistakably like guilt. "This should never have touched you. 11 years I let this house rot from the inside because I was too proud or too tired or too certain that the cost would only ever fall on strangers hired to clean up after my own failures to protect what mattered. I told myself I was doing you a kindness by warning you what the wound might cost. I never once considered that the greater danger in this house was never the curse at all. It was the man I trusted to help me survive it." "You couldn't have known," Iris said, though even as she said it, she understood it wasn't entirely true. Understood that some deeper failure of attention, some willful blindness born of 11 years of grief and exhaustion, had let Cassius Thorne operate undetected for far longer than it should have taken a king of Sebastian's power and intelligence to notice the rot standing directly beside him. But she found, looking at the raw guilt still written across his face, that she did not have it in her to say that out loud. Not tonight, not with her pulse still hammering, and the memory of Cassius's cold grip still fresh on her skin. "I should have known," Sebastian said quietly. "That is precisely the horror of it. And now that I do know, now that the true shape of this curse has finally revealed itself to me, I find I have to ask you a question I have been dreading since the night you first refused to leave this house, and I need you to answer it honestly, because everything that happens next depends on it." Iris looked up at him, at the ancient, exhausted king, standing in the wreckage of his own study, with her bruised wrist still cradled gently in his hands, and felt the full weight of the question before he even asked it, settling over her like the cold that never quite left the east wing of Ashencroft, no matter how many candles burned along its walls. "Ask," she said, "now that you know what Cassius has done," he said slowly. "Now that you understand this curse was never simply an unlucky wound, but a weapon deliberately fed and maintained for over a decade by someone I trusted with my life, I have to know whether you are still willing to be the one who finally closes it. Because breaking a curse of this age and this cruelty was never going to be a simple matter of removing the man who fed it. Augustin Reventhal's built this to punish, and punishment of this magnitude does not release its grip simply because the conduit has been caught. There is still a price left to pay before this wound will ever close, and I no longer have the right to let you walk toward it without telling you, as plainly as I know how, that I do not yet know what that price will demand of you, only that it is coming, and that it is going to demand something neither of us can take back." Iris did not answer him immediately, and to his credit, Sebastian did not press her, standing instead in the wreckage of the study with a patience that felt, after everything she had just witnessed, like its own kind of quiet penance. She thought of Milo, asleep on a couch, 3 hours away with an oxygen line taped beneath his nose, and a heart that was, by the specialist's own blunt calculations, running out of time whether or not she ever came home again. She thought of the 6 names in Cassius Thorne's ledger, 6 people who had walked into this house believing they were only accepting a difficult, well-paid contract, and who had never once been told that they were walking into a decade-long murder disguised as an unsolvable medical mystery. She thought, finally, of the way Sebastian's voice had shaken, faintly, when he asked if she was hurt. A sound she did not think a 300-year-old king had allowed himself to make in front of another living soul in longer than she could imagine. "I'm still here," she said finally. "That hasn't changed just because I know more now." "It should," Sebastian said, though there was something in his voice that sounded almost like relief. "Knowing more should make you more afraid, not less." "Maybe," Iris said. "Or maybe I've just spent 6 years watching people fight to live in rooms where the odds were always this bad, and I never once decided that was a reason to stop showing up. I'm not leaving, Sebastian. Not because I don't understand what this might cost, because I do, and I'm choosing to stay anyway." They moved Cassius Thorne to the lower cells before dawn, and Sebastian, despite the exhaustion visible in every line of his face, insisted on questioning him himself that same night. With Iris present, seated in a hard wooden chair just outside the reach of the iron bars. Close enough to hear everything, far enough. Sebastian had insisted to remain safe if his old friend's desperation curdled into something violent. Cassius, stripped of his careful courtesy, looked older than Iris had ever seen him. His composure, finally, entirely gone, replaced by the raw calculation of a man trying to barter his way out of a sentence he knew, on some level, he had already earned. "Tell her what the curse requires," Sebastian said, his voice flat and cold in a way that made even the guards along the corridor shift uncomfortably. "Tell her exactly what Augustin built into that wound. Or I promise you, old friend, the lower cells will feel like mercy compared to what comes next." Cassius was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Sebastian's face and Iris's, calculating, even now, what version of the truth might still serve him best. "Augustine did not simply want you to suffer," he said finally. "He wanted you to understand, in the deepest possible way, exactly what it costs to love something enough to try to save it. The curse feeds on attempts at healing. Every physician who touched that wound with genuine skill triggered a kind of exchange. A payment demanded not from you, Sebastian, but from them, because Augustine understood, better than any of us, that taking something from the man who loves you is always crueler than simply taking something from you directly." "What kind of payment?" Iris asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "It varies," Cassius said. "A memory. A year of a life. In one case, the physician's ability to ever love another person again, though he did not discover that particular cost until it was far too late to matter. The curse does not announce its price in advance. It simply takes what it decides is owed. Once the healer has done enough real work to threaten the wound's survival, and the closer the healer gets to actually closing it, the greater the price becomes. Because Augustine built this to punish exactly the kind of bond you have clearly allowed to grow in this house. Sebastian, whether you intended it to or not, he built it to make certain that anyone who ever cared enough about you to heal you would pay for that caring with something they could never get back." The room went very still. Iris felt Sebastian's gaze on her before she turned to meet it. And what she saw there was not surprise. Not exactly, but a kind of dawning, horrified recognition, as though some private fear he had been carrying since the very first night she refused to leave. His chamber had just been confirmed in the worst possible way. "You already suspected this," she said quietly. "I suspected the wound demanded a price proportional to genuine progress," he said. "I did not know, until this moment, that the price was specifically tied to affection, that the curse was designed to punish love itself. Which means," Iris said slowly, working through the logic with the same methodical clarity she brought to every impossible case, "that the more this actually works, the more it costs. That the closer I get to closing this wound, the worse whatever it takes from me is going to be." Cassius, watching from behind the bars with an expression that had finally, belatedly, curdled into something like genuine remorse, nodded once. "I am sorry," he said, and for the first time, Iris believed he meant it, even as she understood that his sorrow changed nothing about the 6 graves already behind him. "I told myself, for 11 years, that I was simply managing a tragedy I could not prevent. I did not let myself think too closely about what it meant that every physician who came close enough to matter paid for it with something irreplaceable. I do not expect either of you to forgive that. I only wanted you to understand, finally, exactly what you are choosing to walk toward, Miss Calloway, because I do not think anyone in this house has been honest with you about the true shape of the danger until tonight." Sebastian did not speak again until they had left the lower cells behind, climbing back up through the cold stone corridors toward the east wing in a silence that felt, to Iris, heavier than anything that had passed between them in 6 weeks of careful, guarded evenings. When he finally did speak, his voice had lost every trace of the commanding fury she had witnessed in the study, replaced by something quieter, something that sounded, for the first time since she had met him, almost like fear for someone other than himself. "I am going to release you from this contract," he said, as they reached the door of her suite, effective immediately. "I will pay you everything you were promised, and considerably more besides, and I will arrange transportation home tonight, before sunrise, so that you never have to set foot in this house again." "No," Iris said, and the word came out with more force than she expected, more certainty than she had felt about almost anything in longer than she could remember. "You don't get to make that decision for me, Sebastian. Not after everything I've already seen. Not after everything I already know. I am trying to protect you," he said, and the raw plea beneath the words startled her more than his earlier fury ever had. "I have already lost 6 people to this curse. I do not know if I can survive watching it take something from you too. Not after these past 6 weeks. Not after everything I have let myself feel that I had no right to feel for the woman paid to keep me alive. Then let's find out what it actually wants before either of us decides what we can survive," Iris said, and reached for his hand, feeling the familiar, impossible cold of his skin against hers, a cold she had stopped being afraid of somewhere in the last month, without ever quite noticing the moment it happened. "I didn't come to this house to walk away the first time things got difficult, Sebastian. I came here because my brother needed a miracle and I didn't have one, and somewhere in the last 6 weeks, without either of us really deciding it, this stopped being only about the money. I'm not walking out that door. Not tonight. Not because of a curse neither of us fully understands yet. And not because you're afraid of what it might cost me. I get to choose what I'm willing to risk, and I already have." Sebastian looked down at her for a long, silent moment, the pale grey of his eyes unreadable in the low candlelight, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped into something low and unsteady. stripped entirely of the composed authority he wore for the rest of his court. "Then I need you to understand one more thing before you decide that for certain," he said quietly. "Because Cassius was right about one part of what he told us tonight, the part I have not yet said aloud, even to myself. This curse does not simply punish healing. It punishes love, and I am no longer certain I have the strength left to hide from you, Iris Calloway. Exactly how much of what I feel for you this wound has already decided is worth taking." Iris did not step back from him. Though every rational instinct she had built over 6 years of emergency medicine told her that this was precisely the moment a sensible person would create distance, would remember that the man standing in front of her was a 300-year-old sovereign carrying a curse that fed specifically on affection, and that whatever she felt standing in that cold corridor outside her own bedroom door was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of danger she had been hired to treat rather than invite closer. "Say it anyway," she said instead. Sebastian's jaw tightened, and for a long moment she watched him war with 300 years of careful restraint. The particular discipline of a king who had learned, over centuries of rule, that wanting things too openly was a weakness his enemies would find a way to exploit. "I have watched you work for 6 weeks, he said, finally, his voice low and rough in a way she had never heard from him. "I have watched you refuse to be frightened away by a curse that has killed 6 people before you, watched you interrogate my own seneschal with more courage than half my court has shown in 3 centuries, watched you talk about your brother's coral reefs with a tenderness that undid something in me I did not know still existed after this many years of simply enduring. I told myself, at first, that this was gratitude, that any dying man would come to care for the one person patient enough to sit with him in the dark. I no longer believe that is the whole truth, Iris. And I am telling you now, honestly, because Cassius was right about one thing tonight. This curse punishes love, and I would rather you know exactly what you are risking by staying than let you walk toward it blind. I already knew, Iris said quietly. I've known for at least 2 weeks, if I'm honest. I just didn't have the nerve to say it out loud in a house full of people who report everything back to a ledger. Something in Sebastian's face broke open at that, the careful composure cracking into something raw and startled, and, underneath it, unmistakably hopeful, an expression she suspected very few people in 300 years had ever been permitted to see. "Then you understand what I am telling you," he said. "If this curse takes its price from what I feel for you and from what you have allowed yourself to feel for me, it is not going to take something small." Cassius said it himself. "The closer we get, the greater the cost. I do not know if it will take a memory, or a year, or something crueler still that none of us have imagined yet. I only know that I am no longer willing to let you walk toward that unknowing, the way I let 6 others walk toward it before you. Then let's find out exactly what it wants before it decides on its own," Iris said, and reached up without entirely deciding to, and rested her palm against the cold, familiar line of his jaw, feeling him go very still beneath her touch in the particular way she had come to recognize, over 6 weeks, as the stillness of a man unused to being touched gently. "I'm not asking you to protect me from this by pushing me away, Sebastian. I've spent my whole career walking toward the worst night of someone's life, because somebody has to. I'm not going to stop now just because this time it's mine." They did not speak of it again that night. Not directly. though something had shifted permanently between them in that cold corridor. Some careful distance finally, deliberately closed, and Iris returned to her suite as the first grey light of dawn began to creep beneath the shuttered windows, her mind too full to sleep, turning over everything Cassius had confessed in the lower cells, searching for some detail, some overlooked thread that might tell her exactly what price she was about to be asked to pay. She found it 3 nights later, not in any of Cassius's coded ledgers, which Sebastian's guards had confiscated in full, and which Iris had spent 2 full evenings poring over with the same grim determination she brought to any difficult chart, but in the household's oldest records, a collection of leather-bound family histories kept in a locked case in the East Wing Library that Mrs. Ferris, after Cassius's arrest, had finally allowed her to access without an escort. The Reventhal curse, as it turned out, had a name older than the war that had spawned it. A name that appeared, in careful, faded script, across 3 separate volumes, spanning nearly 2 centuries of the Vale family's own private scholarship, into the dark magic of rival bloodlines. The Widow's Toll, the entries called it. A curse first documented not in the war between Sebastian and Augustine at all, but nearly 200 years earlier, in a conflict between entirely different houses, one Iris had never heard mentioned in any of Sebastian's own accounts of his family's history. The Widow's Toll, one entry explained, in handwriting so old and cramped that Iris had to read it 3 times before the meaning settled into place, was built specifically to punish a bond rather than an individual. It did not simply wound the cursed. It bound the wound itself to whoever loved the cursed enough to attempt its healing, creating a kind of tether between healer and healed that could not be severed by ordinary means. A tether that would, upon the wound's actual closure, demand a final and irreversible exchange. The historical account was frustratingly vague about the exact nature of that exchange, noting only that in the single other recorded instance of the curse being broken, nearly 2 centuries earlier, the healer had not died, and had not lost a memory, and had not aged a single day beyond what time already owed her. She had, instead, according to the brittle, water-stained page, given the curse the only thing it had ever actually wanted from the beginning: her mortality. Iris read the passage 4 times before she fully understood what it was telling her, and when she finally did, she sat very still in the quiet of the library for a long time, feeling the weight of it settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The curse did not want to kill her. It did not want a memory or a year of her life, though it had apparently taken exactly those things from careless or unlucky healers, in less documented cases, over the centuries. What the Widow's Toll actually wanted, in its purest and cruelest form, was a transformation. It wanted to take a mortal woman who loved an immortal king enough to heal him and make certain that her mortality itself became the final payment, the thing that closed the wound permanently, by removing the very difference between them that made loving him a tragedy to begin with. She found Sebastian in his chamber an hour before dawn, and told him everything she had read, watching his expression shift from cautious hope to something far more complicated, as the full shape of what the curse demanded became clear. "It wants to turn you," he said quietly. Once she had finished. "Not kill you, not steal a piece of you the way it stole something from the others. It wants to end your mortality entirely. And it is willing to accept that, as a fair trade for finally releasing its hold on me. That's what the record says. Iris confirmed. Though I have to tell you, reading between the lines, I don't think it's quite that simple. The account doesn't say the healer was turned by the curse itself, only that her mortality became part of what closed the wound. I think, she said slowly, working through the logic the way she worked through any difficult diagnosis, one careful inference at a time, that the curse doesn't have the power to turn anyone on its own. I think it's designed to force a choice. It creates a wound that can only fully close if the healer chooses, of their own will, to become what the person they're healing already is. It's not taking anything from me by force, Sebastian. It's asking me to decide. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone very careful, very controlled. In the way she had learned, meant he was fighting to keep something enormous from breaking loose. I will not ask that of you, he said. I will not let a curse, built by a bitter, defeated man 200 years before either of us existed, dictate the terms of your entire remaining life. You have a brother who needs you exactly as human and exactly as present as you already are. I am not going to be the reason you lose the choice to grow old with him, to watch him build the life he has planned, simply because an ancient wound demands a transformation as its price. I know you're not asking, Iris said gently. That's exactly why I'm the one who gets to decide it. But I need you to hear something else first. Before either of us gets ahead of a decision I haven't actually made yet, because there might be another way through this that doesn't require me giving up anything at all. What way? Sebastian asked, and something in his voice held the particular wariness of a man who had spent 3 centuries learning that hope, in his experience, was usually a prelude to greater loss. The record I found wasn't only about the curse, Iris said. It mentioned the healer who broke it 2 centuries ago by name. Once, buried in a footnote that took me 20 minutes to even find. Her name was Marguerite, and according to the same account, she wasn't simply a physician who happened to fall in love with the man she was healing. She was already something else, entirely before the curse ever touched her. A witch of a particular old bloodline the record only refers to obliquely, one with the specific and exceedingly rare ability to absorb dark magic into her own body without being destroyed by it, the way certain healers can absorb infection from a wound without becoming sick themselves. The curse didn't turn her because it forced her to choose immortality. It turned her because her own magic, drawn directly into the wound during the healing process, reacted with the curse's core mechanism in a way that produced exactly that outcome, an outcome the curse's original architect almost certainly never intended and probably could not have predicted. I am not following where this leaves us, Sebastian said carefully. It means the outcome 200 years ago might not be the only possible outcome, Iris said. It means the curse demands an exchange. Yes, but the shape of that exchange might depend entirely on what the healer actually brings into the wound with them. Marguerite brought magic strong enough to become something new. I don't have magic, Sebastian. I have 6 years of trauma medicine and a nursing license, and a level of stubbornness my supervisors used to write me up for. If I go into that wound tonight with everything I actually am, instead of trying to somehow become what Marguerite was, I don't know what the curse extracts as payment. Nobody has ever tried this with an ordinary human healer before. The record doesn't have an answer for that, because it's never happened. You are proposing an experiment, Sebastian said slowly, with no precedent, on a curse that has already killed 6 trained physicians and threatened to claim a 7th tonight in my own study. I'm proposing that we stop assuming the worst possible outcome is the only one available to us, Iris said. I've spent 6 years watching doctors assume the worst about patients who then went on to prove them wrong, and I've spent 6 years watching doctors assume the best about cases that then fell apart in exactly the way the textbooks predicted. The only thing I actually know for certain is that nobody in this house, not you, not Cassius, not 200 years of Vale family scholarship, has ever tried what I'm about to try, because nobody in 200 years has had a healer stubborn enough or desperate enough or, honestly, in love enough to actually attempt it fully, rather than simply managing the wound the way 6 people before me chose to. I think that matters. I think the curse is going to respond to exactly how much of myself I actually bring into that room tonight, and I would rather find that out on my own terms than spend one more week watching you slowly disappear while we debate the ethics of trying. Sebastian looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression had shifted from fear into something else. Something that looked, Iris thought, almost like awe, the particular disbelief of a man who had spent 3 centuries convinced he had seen every possible variation of human courage, and was only now discovering he had been wrong. "If I lose you to this," he said quietly, "I do not know what kind of king I will become. I have ruled through grief before, Iris. I ruled through the deaths of 6 people this curse claimed before I ever met you. And I told myself each time that I would carry it and continue, because a king does not have the luxury of collapsing under the weight of every loss his throne demands. I do not know if I have that same strength left. If I lose you the same way, then don't plan for losing me," Iris said, and reached for his hand, feeling the familiar cold of it settle against her palm. "Plan for what happens after, when this is over and the wound is finally closed, and neither of us has to spend one more night wondering what a 200-year-old curse is going to demand next. I need you to trust that I know what I'm walking into, Sebastian. The same way you needed me to trust you about Cassius. This is the only way either of us gets to stop living inside this house's worst possibility." Before they could set a date for the attempt, however, word reached Ashencroft that made Sebastian's careful composure crack in a way Iris had not seen since the night he tore Cassius Thorne's study door from its hinges. A courier arrived 2 nights after the trial's initial proceedings had concluded, breathless in the particular way of a messenger who had run the entire distance from the coastal gate rather than trust the news to any slower method, bearing a single sealed letter marked with a wax crest Iris did not recognize, but which made Mrs. Ferris go pale the moment she saw it. Sebastian read the letter in silence, standing in the great hall with the last of the trial's assembled court, still murmuring in small clusters throughout the room, and Iris watched something in his shoulders go rigid, watched 3 centuries of careful royal control fight, visibly against something that looked, for one unguarded moment, like genuine dread. "What is it?" she asked. Once the hall had mostly emptied, and they stood alone beside the tall windows overlooking the dark marsh. "Augustin Reventhal is not dead," Sebastian said, and the words landed in the quiet room like a physical blow. "My people confirmed his death 11 years ago, at the same hour the curse first took hold. I have believed it for over a decade. Every scholar we consulted believed it. But this letter comes from a scout embedded in what remains of the northern courts, and it claims that Augustin has been seen twice now in the past month, moving through territory his own bloodline abandoned generations ago. It claims he learned of Cassius's arrest within days of the sentence being passed, which means he has had eyes inside this house for far longer than any of us suspected, and it claims, Iris, that he intends to reach Ashencroft before the wound can be closed by any means other than the one he originally designed it to demand. Iris felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. The careful, hard-won plan they had spent days constructing suddenly recontextualized by the possibility that the man who had built this curse in the first place was neither dead nor finished with his revenge. He wants to stop us. Why would he care if the wound closes on different terms than he intended? Doesn't he just want Sebastian to suffer either way? He wants Sebastian to suffer specifically. Sebastian said quietly, using his own name with the particular detachment of a man describing a stranger's tragedy rather than his own. Not simply to decay, not merely to rot slowly behind these walls for the remainder of whatever centuries fate allows him. Augustine built the widow's toll to punish love itself. Iris, if he learns that his curse might be broken not through the mortality of the healer, not through the exact cruel exchange he designed 2 centuries of scholarship around, but through something else entirely, something neither of us fully understands yet, he will not simply accept that failure quietly. He will come here himself to make certain the curse claims exactly the price he intended it to claim, by whatever means remain available to him. Mrs. Ferris, who had lingered near the hall's entrance throughout the exchange, stepped forward with the particular grim efficiency Iris had come to recognize as her way of managing fear. "Shall I summon the household guard, my lord? Reinforce the perimeter?" "Yes," Sebastian said. "Double the watch at every gate. I want to know the moment anything unusual crosses onto these grounds, and I want Iris moved to the innermost chamber of the east wing, the one with no windows at all, until we understand exactly what we are facing. I'm not going to hide in a windowless room while you wait for a 200-year-old madman to arrive at your front door," Iris said, before Mrs. Ferris had even finished nodding her understanding of the order. "If Augustin is coming here specifically to stop the wound from closing on our terms, then the safest thing either of us can do is close it before he ever gets the chance to interfere. Waiting only gives him more time to reach us." Sebastian turned to her with an expression caught somewhere between exasperation and the same reluctant admiration she had watched cross his face more than once in the past 7 weeks. "You are, without question, the most stubborn mortal I have encountered in 3 centuries of rule," he said. "I mean that as the highest compliment I currently have the composure to offer. I'll take it." Iris said, "Now tell me honestly, how much time do we actually have before he could reach Ashencroft?" Sebastian consulted the letter again, his jaw tight. The scout's report suggests he was last seen 4 days north of here, moving with the kind of urgency that implies he already knows about Cassius's sentencing. If he travels by the fastest means available to a creature of his age and power, he could reach the coastal territories within 2 nights, perhaps 3. If the household guard along the northern border managed to slow him at all, which I would not count on given what remains of Augustine Reventhal's reputation even after 2 centuries of exile, then we don't have time to wait for the household to feel fully prepared. Iris said, "We do this tomorrow night, before he arrives, before he has any chance at all to interfere with something neither of us is even certain will work the way we hope." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risk with the same careful calculation she imagined he had applied to every major decision of his 300-year reign. And then he nodded. Once, a gesture that seemed to cost him something visible. "Tomorrow night," he agreed. "But I want the household guard doubled regardless. And I want you never more than a single room away from me until this is finished, one way or another." They spent the following day in a strange, suspended quiet, the household moving around them with the particular hushed urgency of people bracing for a storm. They could feel building on the horizon, but had not yet learned to see. Iris spent part of the afternoon in the East Wing library, cross-referencing everything she could find about the Reventhal bloodline's remaining magic, searching for any detail that might tell her whether Augustin, even at 200 years removed from the curse's original casting, retained any power to interfere with its closing directly, and found, to her mild relief, that the historical record suggested the widow's toll, once set into motion, operated independently of its original caster, a kind of magic designed specifically to outlive the grudge that spawned it. That should mean he can't simply reach into the wound and change the terms. She told Sebastian that evening, as they reviewed her findings together in the great chamber where the attempt would take place the following night. Whatever the curse decides to demand, it decides based on what actually happens between us in that room, not based on anything Augustin does from the outside. He can threaten us. He can try to stop the attempt from happening at all. But once we begin, I don't think he has any power left to alter what the curse actually takes as payment. That is a comforting theory, Sebastian said, though the tightness in his voice suggested he found less comfort in it than he was willing to admit outright. I would still prefer he never sets foot on these grounds at all. He set the attempt for the following night, the 7th week of Iris's contract, under a waning moon that gave the marsh beyond Ashencroft's shuttered windows an eerie, silvered light that seemed, to Iris, entirely appropriate for what they were about to do. Mrs. Ferris prepared the master's chamber with a kind of grim, efficient reverence, clearing away every unnecessary object, laying out clean linens and sterile instruments with the same careful precision she brought to every task in the house. Though Iris noticed, more than once, the older woman's hands trembling faintly as she worked, the first crack Iris had seen in her otherwise unshakable composure in 7 full weeks. "You do not have to do this," Mrs. Ferris said quietly, as she helped Iris prepare, her voice stripped of its usual formal distance. "I have served this house for over a century, Miss Calloway. I watched Master Vale bury his own parents. I watched him win the war that broke the Reventhal line. I have never, in all that time, seen him care for another living soul the way he has come to care for you these past 7 weeks, and I confess, I am afraid of what happens to this entire court if that care costs him the very person who finally gave him a reason to fight for something beyond mere survival." "I know," Iris said. "I'm afraid of it too. But I've spent 6 years running toward the worst nights of other people's lives because somebody has to. And I'm not going to stop the one time it actually matters to me personally." Sebastian was already waiting when she entered the chamber, seated upright in the great bed for the first time in the 7 weeks she had known him, his shirt discarded, the wound on his side visible in the low blue candlelight. More necrotic now, more deeply veined with silver-black threads than it had been on the night she first arrived, as though the confrontation with Cassius had accelerated whatever slow decay the curse had been managing for over a decade. He watched her approach with an expression that held more open vulnerability than she had ever seen from him. The last of his careful royal composure finally, entirely stripped away. "Are you certain?" he asked, for what she suspected was the final time he intended to ask it. "I'm certain," she said, and pulled on her gloves, though something in her, some quiet instinct she did not examine too closely, told her that gloves were not going to matter for what came next. "Whatever this wound wants from me tonight, it's not going to change what I already decided the moment I walked through your front gate 7 weeks ago. I came here to save a life. I'm not leaving until I have." She pressed her bare palm against the ruined flesh at the last moment, deliberately, peeling off the glove she had worn into every treatment for 7 weeks, because some quiet certainty had settled into her chest, standing over him in the low blue light, that whatever the curse actually wanted could not be delivered through a barrier, that the entire architecture of the Widow's Toll had been built, from the very beginning, to punish exactly the kind of unguarded, skin-to-skin contact that real healing, real love, actually required. The pain hit her before she had time to brace for it. A white, blinding surge that started at her palm and radiated up through her arm and into her chest, with a force that made her cry out, distantly aware of Sebastian's voice calling her name from somewhere that felt suddenly very far away, of his cold hands gripping her shoulders to keep her upright as her knees buckled beneath her. The wound beneath her palm pulsed once, violently, the silver-black threads flaring bright, as though something ancient and starved had finally, after 11 long years, recognized the shape of a payment it could actually accept, and Iris felt something inside her chest tear loose. Not physically, not in any way. She could have described to another nurse, in clinical terms, but in some deeper, more essential place. A sensation like watching a door she had not known existed swing suddenly open onto a room full of light. She saw, in the space of a single suspended heartbeat, images that did not belong to her, fragments of a man's 3 centuries of memory pouring backward through the connection her bare palm had made with his ruined flesh. A battlefield soaked in old blood, a woman's face lit by candlelight 200 years before Iris was born. The particular grief of watching everyone you have ever loved grow old and die while you remained exactly, agonizingly, the same. She understood, in that single overwhelming instant, the full and terrible weight of what it had cost Sebastian Vale to survive 300 years of rule. And something in her, some part of her that had spent 6 years learning to carry other people's suffering without letting it break her, simply opened wide enough to hold it. When the pain finally receded, she was on her knees on the floor beside the bed. Sebastian's arms wrapped around her, his voice raw and desperate in a way she had never heard from him, repeating her name over and over, as though the sound of it might anchor her to the room. "Iris," he said. "Iris, look at me. Tell me what it took. Tell me what you lost." She opened her eyes slowly, and the first thing she registered, with the same clinical clarity she brought to every assessment, was that she felt, if anything, more present than she had in years, not diminished, not hollowed out the way she had braced herself to feel, but sharpened, as though some fog she had not even known she was carrying had finally lifted. "Look at the wound," she said, instead of answering him directly, because some instinct told her the answer mattered less, in this moment, than the outcome. Sebastian's eyes dropped to his own side, and Iris watched his face change, watched 3 centuries of careful composure crack open into something raw and disbelieving as he stared down at flesh that was, for the first time in 11 years, simply flesh, pink and whole, and entirely unmarked by silver-black threads or the deep necrotic black that had haunted every night of her contract. The wound had closed, not scarred over, not merely arrested in its decay, but closed entirely, as though it had never been inflicted at all. "It's gone," Sebastian whispered, his hand moving to touch the unmarked skin with an expression of such profound, disbelieving wonder that Iris felt something in her chest ache at the sight of it. 11 years, Iris. 11 years, and it's simply gone. "I know," she said, and found, to her surprise, that she was crying, though she could not entirely say whether it was relief or something else entirely. Some residual weight of the memories that had poured through her in that single overwhelming instant. Memories that did not fully belong to her, but that she suspected, with a strange, certain clarity, she was never going to be entirely free of again. It took something, Sebastian. I felt it happen. But I don't think it took what we were afraid it would. What did it take? He asked again, gentler this time, his hands framing her face with a tenderness that made the ancient cold of his skin feel, for the first time, like something warm. "I think," she said slowly, working through the strange new clarity settling into her chest, that it took the distance. Not my mortality, not a memory or a year of my life, the way it took from the others. I think the curse was built to punish exactly the specific loneliness of loving someone across an unbridgeable gap, the particular cruelty of caring for a person you can never fully understand, because your entire existence and theirs run on such fundamentally different terms. And I think, when I went in there tonight, without holding anything back, without a glove, without any barrier at all, it decided that gap had already closed on its own, the same night I chose to stay instead of walking out your front door. I don't feel like I lost anything, Sebastian. I feel like I finally understand exactly what these past 300 years have cost you. All of it. Every single grief you've been carrying alone since long before I was born. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gently along her cheekbone, wiping away tears she had not realized were still falling. And when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something so raw, so entirely unguarded, that Iris understood she was hearing a version of him that had not existed in front of another living soul in longer than either of them could measure. "I do not know how to thank you for a gift like that," he said. "I do not know if such a thing can even be thanked properly. You have carried 11 years of my grief into your own body, simply so that I would not have to carry it alone any longer. And I find I have no language ancient enough or precise enough to tell you what that means to a man who has spent 3 centuries believing no one would ever be capable of understanding the true weight of what immortality actually costs." "Then don't thank me," Iris said, and leaned into his hand, feeling the cold, familiar comfort of it against her cheek. "Just don't waste whatever time we have left arguing about whether I was allowed to choose this. I chose it. I'd choose it again." They did not have long to sit with the wonder of it. The chamber door burst open before either of them had fully risen from the floor. Not with the splintering violence of Sebastian's own entrance into Cassius's study weeks earlier, but with a slower, more deliberate force. Iron hinges, groaning as though something ancient and patient were taking its time, announcing itself. Mrs. Ferris stood in the doorway, her composure finally entirely shattered, blood streaking one side of her face from a wound already beginning to close with the slow resilience of her kind. "He's here," she gasped. "Augustine Reventhal's is at the front gate. He came through the northern perimeter faster than any of us believed possible, and he has already killed 3 of the household guard trying to stop him." Sebastian was on his feet before she finished speaking, positioning himself between Iris and the door with an instinctive, protective speed that belied the exhaustion of what he had just endured, his newly healed side flexing without a trace of the pain that had defined it for 11 years. "Take Iris to the inner chamber," he said to Mrs. Ferris. "Now." "I'm not going anywhere," Iris said, pulling herself upright, despite the lingering, strange fullness in her chest, where Sebastian's centuries of grief had settled only minutes before. "If he's here to punish us for closing the wound on our own terms, then he's going to find out exactly how that closing actually happened, and I'd rather be standing beside you when he learns it than hiding 3 rooms away wondering what's happening." There was no time to argue the point further. A presence swept through the corridor beyond the chamber door with a cold, suffocating weight that made every candle along the walls gutter and dim in unison. And a moment later, Augustine Reventhal stood in the doorway Mrs. Ferris had just vacated, and Iris understood, in a single glance, exactly why his name alone had once been enough to break entire courts. He did not look like a man who had spent 2 centuries in bitter exile, scraping together whatever remained of a shattered bloodline's power. He looked, instead, like something that had been carefully, patiently sharpened by every one of those 200 years, tall and gaunt, in a way that suggested strength rather than depletion, his eyes a flat, colorless white that held none of the warmth even Sebastian's coldest expression still carried, his presence filling the room with a pressure that made Iris's ears ache faintly, as though the air itself had thickened around him. "Sebastian Vale," Augustine said, his voice carrying none of the theatrical menace Iris might have expected from a 2-centuries-old grudge, only a flat, exhausted certainty that was somehow more frightening than any dramatic threat could have been. I felt my curse break from 4 days' distance. I did not believe it at first. 11 years of careful maintenance, undone in a single evening by a mortal woman with no magic of her own to speak of. I confess I came here more out of professional curiosity than any real hope of reversing what has already been done. "Then you should turn around and leave the way you came," Sebastian said, his voice dropping into the same cold, commanding register Iris had heard him use against Cassius in the study. Though she noticed, standing close enough to feel the tension in his body, that this particular calm cost him considerably more effort to maintain. "What's done is done. Augustine, your curse has been broken. Whatever grievance drove you to build it in the first place, it has run its course. There is nothing left here for you to collect." Augustine's colorless eyes moved past Sebastian to Iris, studying her with the same clinical, unhurried attention Iris imagined a scholar might give to an unexpected anomaly in an otherwise well-understood experiment. "You are the 7th, he said, "the one who finally succeeded where 6 trained physicians failed. Tell me, healer, what did my curse take from you? in exchange for its mercy. I am curious whether 2 centuries of careful design produced the outcome I intended, or whether you have found some clever loophole that will require correcting. It didn't take my mortality, Iris said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage under the weight of his attention. It took the distance between us instead. Whatever grief you built into that wound to punish him, I carried it. All of it. I don't think that's a loophole, Augustine. I think it's exactly what happens when someone actually finishes what your curse was pretending to demand all along. Real understanding. Instead of the sacrifice you assumed anyone foolish enough to love him would eventually have to make. Something shifted behind Augustine's flat white eyes. A flicker of genuine surprise that seemed, for a moment, to crack the careful stillness of his ancient composure. That was never meant to be possible, he said quietly, almost to himself. The widow's toll was built on the certainty that mortal love cannot survive contact with what it is trying to heal without being fundamentally changed by the encounter. It was built to prove definitively that Sebastian Vale would always cost the people who loved him something irreplaceable, the same way he cost my family everything the night he burned our house to the ground and called it justice. I did not burn your house to the ground, Sebastian said, his voice tight with old, bitter history. Iris understood she was only glimpsing the smallest fragment of. Your father declared war on my territories first. Augustine. I ended that war as quickly and as decisively as I could, because a slow war costs more lives than a fast one, and I have spent 3 centuries learning that lesson at considerable personal cost. I am sorry for what your family lost. I have never once pretended otherwise, but I will not stand here and let you punish an innocent woman for the sin of loving me honestly, simply because 2 centuries of grief never let you imagine that kind of honesty was possible. Augustine's expression hardened. The brief crack in his composure ceiling shut again into something colder and more resolved. Then I will simply have to design something new, he said. And the temperature in the room dropped sharply enough that Iris felt her breath fog in the cold air. Something that does not depend on the healer's mortality at all. Something that takes instead from the one thing a mortal woman cannot heal her way around, no matter how honest her love proves to be. Time, Sebastian. I will simply take her time instead. Every year she might have had left with you, collapsed into a single terrible instant, so that you may spend the next 3 centuries exactly as alone as you deserve to be. He moved before Sebastian could react. A blur of ancient, desperate speed aimed not at Sebastian at all, but directly at Iris, and Iris had only enough time to register the flat, white terror of his eyes, closing the distance between them, before Sebastian intercepted him mid-motion with a collision that shook the entire chamber. The 2 ancient creatures crashing through the heavy wooden furniture Mrs. Ferris had so carefully arranged only hours earlier. Splinters and shattered glass scattering across the floor in a violent arc. Iris scrambled backward, her heart hammering, watching 2 of the oldest and most powerful creatures she had ever encountered tear through the room with a speed and ferocity that made the fight with Cassius weeks earlier look almost restrained by comparison. Augustine fought with the cold, patient precision of 2 centuries, spent doing nothing but preparing for exactly this confrontation, while Sebastian fought with the raw, desperate fury of a man defending something he had only just discovered he was capable of loving without reservation. And for several long, terrifying minutes, Iris could not tell which of those 2 forces was winning. It was Mrs. Ferris, in the end. who tipped the balance, returning to the doorway with 3 members of the household guard and a heavy iron brazier still glowing with the coals of the chamber's hearth fire. And though Iris would never fully understand the specific mechanics of what happened next, she watched Augustine falter for just long enough, distracted by the sudden influx of reinforcements, for Sebastian to drive him backward through the shattered remains of the chamber's tall windows and out onto the stone balcony beyond, where the pale light of the waning moon caught the 2 of them locked in a final, brutal struggle at the very edge of a 3-story drop. "This ends tonight," Sebastian said, his voice carrying back into the chamber with a finality that made the hair on Iris's arms stand on end. "You do not touch her, Augustine. You do not touch anyone in this house ever again. I ended your father's war 2 centuries ago because I believed then that a swift end cost fewer lives than a slow one. I am going to end yours tonight for exactly the same reason." Augustine's answer, if he offered one, was lost in the violent, final motion that followed. A single, decisive strike that sent him over the balcony's edge and down into the dark marsh grass below, and though Iris rushed to the shattered window in time to see the pale shape of him crumple against the ground 3 stories down, she understood, watching Sebastian's chest heave with breaths he did not technically need, that whatever remained of Augustine Reventhal's 2 centuries of bitter, patient revenge had finally, permanently ended. The household guard recovered the body before dawn, and Sebastian, standing over the wreckage of the man who had authored 11 years of his slow decay and 2 centuries of festering grief before that, said nothing at all for a long time, simply staring down at the marsh with an expression Iris could not fully read. "It's over," she said finally, coming to stand beside him. "It's over," he agreed, though his voice carried a weariness that suggested the ending, however necessary, brought him no particular satisfaction. "I have spent 3 centuries ending wars I did not choose to start, Iris. I find I take no pleasure in it. Even now, even against a man who came here tonight intending to take from you exactly what he could not manage to take from me directly. I am only grateful, more grateful than I have words for, that it did not cost either of us what he intended it to cost." They returned to the chamber together as the first grey light of dawn began to creep over the marsh, and Iris, exhausted beyond anything 6 years of emergency medicine had ever demanded of her, allowed herself, finally, to simply rest against him, feeling the steady, impossible stillness of a man who did not need to breathe and did so anyway. She suspected, because he had learned, somewhere in the past 7 weeks, that the sound of it comforted her. The following weeks brought a reckoning Iris had not fully anticipated, though she supposed, looking back, she should have known that a curse 11 years in the making did not simply resolve itself the moment the wound closed, leaving no further business behind it. Cassius Thorne's trial before the full coastal court took place 3 nights after the wound healed. A formal, ancient proceeding conducted in a great hall Iris had not known existed within Ashencroft's sprawling grounds, packed with nobles and lesser bloodlines from across the eastern seaboard. All of them come to witness the judgment of a seneschal who had betrayed his sovereign for over a decade. Sebastian did not kill him. Iris had expected, given the raw fury she had witnessed in the study weeks earlier, that the trial would end in exactly the kind of brutal finality she had read about in the 6 previous stories Cassius's ledger implied. But Sebastian, standing before his assembled court with Iris seated at his side in a place of honor she had not expected and had not entirely known how to accept, pronounced instead a sentence of permanent exile stripped of title, stripped of the protections of the coastal court, banished from every territory Sebastian's rule extended across, forbidden ever to set foot in Ashencroft or any of its holdings again, under penalty of a death Sebastian promised. In a voice that carried to every corner of the great hall, would not be quick. I built this court on the principle that strength and loyalty are not the same virtue, and that a sovereign who cannot tell the difference deserves whatever betrayal eventually finds him, Sebastian said, his voice carrying the particular weight of a king who had learned that lesson at devastating personal cost. I trusted Cassius Thorne more than any other creature in 3 centuries of rule, and he repaid that trust with 11 years of quiet poison disguised as friendship. I will not repeat his cruelty by pretending exile is mercy. It is not mercy. It is simply the punishment that leaves him alive long enough to understand, every single day for however many centuries remain to him, exactly what he threw away. Iris watched the color drain from what remained of Cassius's composure as the sentence was read, watched him escorted from the great hall in silence, and found, to her own surprise, that she felt no satisfaction in it at all, only a kind of tired, hollow relief that the immediate danger, at least, had finally passed. Milo's transplant came through 9 weeks after Iris returned home, a piece of news that arrived by phone while she sat at her brother's bedside in a hospital room 3 hours from Ashencroft, and though the timing felt, to her exhausted, grieving heart, almost too perfectly cruel to be coincidence, the surgeon who called to deliver the news assured her, more than once, that the donor match had come through an entirely ordinary channel, an anonymous registry entry that had simply, finally, aligned. She did not ask Sebastian directly whether his considerable resources and centuries of accumulated influence had played any quiet role in accelerating that particular alignment. She suspected, watching him arrive at the hospital within hours of her call despite the daylight hour, wrapped in a heavy coat and moving with visible discomfort through corridors flooded with sunlight he should not have been able to tolerate at all, that some questions were kinda left unasked. Milo's surgery succeeded. Iris sat in a waiting room designed for exactly this kind of unbearable, suspended dread, and felt Sebastian's cold hand close around hers, somewhere in the 3rd hour, and did not let go of it again until the surgeon finally emerged, exhausted and smiling, to tell her that her brother's new heart was already beating steady and strong. Milo, once he was well enough to ask questions, wanted to know everything about the strange, pale, unnervingly composed man who visited every single day of his recovery, who spoke to him at length and with genuine, careful interest about coral reef restoration, about the particular fragility of ecosystems that had survived for millennia, only to falter, finally, under pressures they were never built to withstand. An irony Iris suspected was not lost on either of them. "He talks like he's actually been to those places," Milo said one afternoon, several weeks into his recovery, once Sebastian had stepped out to take a call from the coastal court, and Iris was left alone with her brother for the first time in what felt like months. Not like he read about the Great Barrier Reef in a book, like he watched it happen, like he remembers what it looked like before it started dying. Iris considered for a long moment how much of the truth her 17-year-old brother, sharp as he was, could actually be trusted to carry without it changing the way he looked at the world for the rest of his life. "He's older than he looks," she said finally, which was, she reasoned, not remotely a lie. Milo studied her with the particular knowing look of a teenager who had spent 2 years watching his sister disappear for stretches of unexplained time, and return each time looking simultaneously more exhausted and more alive than before. And he did not push the question any further, though Iris suspected, watching the small, satisfied smile that crossed his face, that some part of him had already guessed considerably more of the truth than either of them was prepared to discuss directly. "Whatever he is," he added instead, after a moment, "he looks at you like you hung the actual moon, Iris. I don't think I've ever seen anyone look at you like that, not even close." Iris did not have an answer for that, not one she trusted herself to say aloud, without her voice breaking. So she simply reached over and squeezed her brother's hand, feeling, for the first time in 2 years, the strong and steady pulse of a heart that was finally, actually going to let him grow old. "He's a friend," Iris told her brother. The first time Milo asked, directly, whether the pale man who visited every day was the reason his impossible new heart had arrived exactly when it did. Milo, 17 and sharper than either of them gave him credit for, looked between his sister and the man seated at his bedside with an expression that suggested he was not remotely satisfied by that answer, though he was gracious enough, in the particular way of a teenager who had just been handed a second chance at an entire future, not to press the matter any further that day. Sebastian Vale did not return to the throne of the coastal court with the same weary resignation he had carried for 11 years before the curse finally broke. Iris noticed it in small ways at first. In the way he laughed more easily during the long evenings they spent together in the months that followed, in the way his correspondence, no longer tainted by a decade of quiet poison, arrived each week without the particular heaviness that had always seemed to follow him from room to room. He offered her, more than once, everything his considerable wealth and power could provide: a place at Ashencroft, a permanent position in his household, resources enough to ensure Milo's continued recovery and education without a single further worry about cost. And Iris, true to the same stubbornness that had carried her through 6 years of emergency medicine and 7 weeks of a contract that should, by any reasonable measure, have killed her, accepted some of it and refused the rest, insisting on keeping her own work, her own hospital shifts, her own hard-won independence, even as the relationship between them deepened into something neither of them had fully expected to survive the wound that first brought them together. "I did not save your life because I wanted to be kept," she told him one evening, months later, sitting together on the wide veranda of Ashencroft as the last light faded over the marsh, Milo's laughter carrying faintly from somewhere inside the house, where he had taken, in recent weeks, to visiting on weekends with a curiosity about the estate's grounds that Sebastian indulged with a patience Iris found, each time she witnessed it, quietly devastating. "I saved it because 6 years of watching people die taught me that some fights are worth showing up for, even when the odds are terrible. I'm not going to stop being exactly who I was before I walked through your front gate, Sebastian. Not for you. Not for anyone. I would not want you to be anyone else," Sebastian said, and reached for her hand in the fading light, the same cold, familiar grip that had once frightened her and now felt entirely like coming home. "I spent 3 centuries believing that immortality had cost me the capacity to be surprised by anything the world still had to offer. You have proven me wrong more times in the past year than I can count. And I find, against every careful instinct. 300 years of rule ever taught me that I have absolutely no interest in being right about that particular fear ever again. Mrs. Ferris, who had taken to joining them on the veranda some evenings with a tray of tea, neither of them had requested, but both had come to expect, set the porcelain down carefully between them, and lingered a moment longer than strict duty required, watching the two of them with an expression that had softened considerably since the terrible night Cassius Thorne's betrayal first came to light. "If I may say so, my lord," she said, and the careful formality of the address did nothing to disguise the genuine warmth underneath it. "This house has not felt like a home in longer than I care to admit. Not since your parents' time, if I am honest, and certainly not through 11 years of watching you carry that wound alone rather than ask any of us to share the weight of it. I find I much prefer it this way." "As do I," Sebastian said quietly, watching her retreat back toward the house with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything. And Iris felt something settle in her chest at the simple, unguarded honesty of it. A king who had spent 3 centuries learning to hide every soft thing about himself, finally, deliberately, choosing not to. The coastal court, in the months that followed, adjusted slowly to the reality of a sovereign who no longer bore the visible weight of a decade-old curse, who arrived at council meetings with a clarity and steadiness his advisers had not seen from him in over a decade, and who made no particular secret, among those closest to the throne, of exactly who had made that recovery possible. There were whispers, of course, the particular gossip that traveled fast through old bloodlines with too much time and too little to occupy it. Some of it curious, some of it faintly resentful of a mortal woman's sudden influence over a king who had spent 3 centuries keeping every advisor at a careful, professional distance. Iris found, to her own quiet surprise, that she cared less about the whispers than she might once have expected. She had spent 6 years being underestimated by people with more letters after their names and less actual instinct for saving a life, and she found the particular disdain of a few centuries-old nobles who had never once sat with a dying man through the worst hours of his suffering did not carry the weight it might once have. Sebastian asked her, on a night nearly a year after she had first walked through Ashencroft's front gate, whether she had ever regretted the choice that had brought her there, the desperate, exhausted decision of a woman with a dying brother and no better options left to consider. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted, sitting beside him in the same chamber where the wound had first closed, the same room that had once smelled of old blood and quiet decay, and now, simply, smelled of beeswax candles and the particular clean night air that drifted in through windows finally, permanently unshuttered. "I think about how close I came to hanging up on that recruiter. I think about what would have happened to Milo if I had. And I think, honestly, that I would make the exact same choice again every single time, even knowing everything it was going to cost me to walk through that front door. Some risks are only frightening in hindsight, Sebastian. In the moment, they just feel like the only reasonable thing left to do." "I am endlessly grateful you found it reasonable," Sebastian said, and something in his voice, warm and unguarded, in a way 3 centuries of careful royal composure had never quite managed to fully suppress, made Iris lean into him without a second thought, feeling the familiar, impossible cold of him settle around her like the safest kind of shelter she had ever known. The story of the seventh nurse never reached the town of Savannah, never appeared in any newspaper or record the mortal world might have access to, because the household of Ashencroft, true to 11 years of hard-won discretion, kept its own counsel about exactly what had transpired behind its shuttered windows during those 7 fraught weeks. But within the coastal court, among the old bloodlines, who had watched their sovereign quietly rot for over a decade and had begun, in private, to whisper about succession, the story of Iris Calloway became something closer to legend, the mortal woman who walked into a house that had already claimed 6 healers before her and walked out again, having broken a 200-year-old curse, not through magic, not through desperate sacrifice, but through the simple, radical decision to hold nothing back from a wound everyone else had been too afraid to touch honestly. She did not become immortal that night, and she never would, choosing instead, in the years that followed, to live out her mortal life exactly as she had always intended, aging, growing, watching her brother build the career in marine biology he had once described to her in a hospital waiting room as the only thing that made his failing heart feel worth fighting for. Sebastian Vale, for his part, learned to measure his centuries differently after that, no longer counting the years as an endless, exhausting accumulation of loss, but as a gift he had somehow, impossibly, been given the chance to spend beside someone who understood, in the deepest and most literal sense a curse could ever teach, exactly what he carried, and had chosen, freely, to help him carry it anyway. The seventh nurse never became immortal, never traded her mortality for a king's survival, the way 2 centuries of grim precedent had once insisted was the only possible outcome. And yet, in every way that mattered, she remained bound to Sebastian Vale for the whole of her ordinary, remarkable life. Not through any curse, not through any magic older than the 2 of them, but through the simple, radical choice she had made the night she walked into a wound 6 trained physicians had refused to touch honestly and gave it everything she had, rather than only what she thought it was safe to offer. If you were moved by Iris and Sebastian's story, by a curse that could only be broken through honesty rather than sacrifice, hit that like button, share this video with anyone who believes in the kind of love that shows up even when the diagnosis looks impossible, and subscribe for more dark romance tales of vampire kings, forbidden bonds, and the mortal women brave enough to save them. Drop a comment below and tell us what price you think love should never have to pay.